Hi, I'm Owen from Rask Australia. Thanks for tuning in to the Rask Network.
Before we get into today's show, there are a few things we have to go over.
Firstly, what you're about to hear and see is limited to general information only. It's not personal financial advice like you get from a financial planner. Also, it's important to remember that past performance is not indicative of future performance. That means that anything that's happened in the past, or we say today, is not necessarily going to reflect what happens in the future. Lastly, please consider that any of the guests or myself are featuring on this program may have a financial interest in some of the products or shares mentioned. That's enough from me. I hope you enjoyed today's program.
Welcome to the Australian Property Podcast. My name is Amy Lunardi. I am a property buyer's agent based in Melbourne. And today we have a bit of a different episode. We've got a special guest, an extra special guest, Kate from the Australian Finance Podcast. Actually, she wears many, many hats. And she has recently written a book. And that book is called Buying Happiness, Learn to Invest Your Time and Money Better. And I've just finished reading this book and I thought it would be great to have her on the podcast because when we're talking about money and when we're talking about happiness and time, we can absolutely relate all of this back to property in many ways. So I think that this episode is going to be really helpful for anyone who is in that process of considering maybe buying a house in the future, or maybe they're saving at the moment, or maybe you've bought a property and now you're needing to manage your time and money and happiness, but because you're paying off a mortgage. So Kate, thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me, Amy. It's a bit fun to jump onto one of our other podcasts today.
Yeah. So first of all, this book, what inspired you to write this book?
I've been talking about money and investing and personal finance with everyone for the last 7 years. And the thing is, we often forget what's important because we get stuck in the budgets and the spreadsheets and creating the perfect portfolio. But sometimes we forget about why we're doing it. And maybe we're building wealth to spend more time with our friends and family. We're building wealth to have freedom and control over our time and our life. But we can get pretty forgetful of that during the messy middle where we're putting everything into practice. So I think this book just pulls together all the conversations I've had on the podcast over the last 7 years. It brings together research on how to use your time and money better to give yourself a happiness boost, because at the end of the day, we all want to be happy. We want meaning and fulfillment and satisfaction in our lives. And so how does money and time play into that was a really interesting angle that I explored. And there's also a bit in there about your money mindset when it comes to goal setting, how you have money conversations with other people, the ways our brain plays tricks on us with things like analysis paralysis, which I'm sure happens in the world of property too. I know it happens a lot with people making their first investments, and just gives people some of the starting points for their own investing journey. But it's not actually a book about property. So it's going to be interesting to have this conversation today, Amy.
Yeah, and what you just said before about figuring out your why, I think that's something that sometimes people kind of have an idea about, but have never really sat down and figured out what their why is, what their purpose is. Why are you wanting to earn money? Why are you wanting to be more successful? Like what is the ultimate goal, and what are the things that will make you happy? And I often see this as well with property goals, in that a lot of people don't sit down and think, well, why do I actually want to buy a property? It is very much the thing to do, right? It's something which everyone thinks that's the expectation of, first of all, you start out your career, or you do your degree, or you get your education, whatever that might be, and then you buy a house. And it's just the next logical step in life, but it's not going to be the right thing for everyone. I do think at some point in your life, you do need to have housing security through owning a property, but it's certainly not something that you need to rush into or do before you're ready, because it is such a huge commitment. And I've spoken to many, many people over the years who, once I've actually sort of questioned their why, especially people who are in situations where they can't necessarily afford what they want right now, and in which case buying a property is actually going to maybe compromise their lifestyle, but they feel like they just have to do it, whether that's a home or an investment property. And then they take some time to sit back and maybe just reassess a little bit. So yeah, absolutely figuring out what your why is. And with your why as well, Kate, there was one of the sort of first paragraphs in the book talks about happiness and how happiness is essentially freedom. Would you then say that money is therefore freedom, because technically the more money you have, the less you have to worry about things and the more time you could have because the less time you need to work? Is that kind of the overall summary of the book here?
I'd say that money gives you the opportunity for freedom and happiness and choice. It doesn't necessarily mean that if we've got $1 million in the bank account, we're just going to be instantly happy, because there's usually a lot of stuff we have to do behind the scenes. Because if we can't start enjoying the process, we're not going to necessarily enjoy the end goal, because it's only going to be a moment that we're excited to see $1 million in the bank account. If we don't enjoy the work that we do in the lead up, then it's going to be very challenging to be happy long term. And so I think that's really interesting with the property stuff you were saying, Amy, because I see a lot like the Instagram posts when people buy their first property and it's really exciting and everyone gets behind you and people really support you when it comes to your property goals. But when it comes to investing in other things, maybe it's shares or exchange traded funds, no one really gets that excited. And so you don't feel like you've got all this support behind you. And I've said it a few times at events, like when you get your first dividend, if you don't have anyone to tell, to like send me a message and I'll be excited for you, because that's an exciting step and it's a milestone on a slightly different investment journey. It might not be your first night living in the new place or your first rental payment from a tenant, but in making your first investment in a company or an ETF and getting your first dividend is also a really exciting milestone. And people celebrate it very differently. Like people don't really want to know if you're investing unless they're friends that are interested in investing themselves. It's seen really differently. And I think that changes the way we work towards these goals as well. Like property, you can tell everyone that you're saving up for a property and this is where you want to buy, and everybody gives you their advice. But when it comes to investing, it's something we do a little bit more quietly in the background. So I think that plays into the way we set the goals as well, just like what everyone thinks around us.
I think the benefit these days with social media and the internet and podcasts is that you can actually find these people now. Maybe they're not going to be in your direct group of friends who you're going to be talking about investing and, buying your first share, etc. But you can actually reach out and find these people. And it is really helpful to get involved and be in these communities, because you can learn from each other and you can share your goals and celebrate each other's wins. Yeah. So don't feel like just because you weren't raised in a family who didn't talk about money, I certainly wasn't, that or your friends aren't involved in that you can't get involved, because it is out there. And Kate, where would you suggest getting started with finding these kind of groups and this kind of support? Because it is super helpful to keep you on track.
Yeah, I mean, if you listen to guests of the finance podcast, the property podcast, you can then, if someone really interests you and you like their perspective and what they have to say, you can usually go and find other places where they're hanging out, whether that's Instagram or LinkedIn or TikTok maybe, who knows. But you can kind of like slowly just follow your interest and find interesting people online. I mean, there's a lot of Facebook groups, like there's other groups, like financial independence Facebook groups, like the Aussie Firebug Facebook group. And they're not places I particularly comment a lot, but I just sort of lurk, and it's interesting to see what people have to say. It's not necessarily 100% accurate all the time. So I'd always go into these communities, whether it's Facebook, Reddit, Instagram, TikTok, with your savvy consumer hat on, because not necessarily everything is financially vetted. But it's interesting to see what's possible. And I think that is a really important one. If you haven't grown up with a family and friendship group talking about money, you don't necessarily know what's possible. You might think you can only invest in one way, or that only this is possible career path-wise. And then when you see people talking about it online, you go, oh, I could do this, or I could do a business that does this. And so you start to soak up all of these different possibilities, which I think helps you create goals that are more suitable to you, not necessarily like the default go to uni, buy a house, have a family path, which I hope that our generation is slowly changing and challenging that and actually going, well, how do I want to spend my time? I don't necessarily want to go bam, bam, bam. I want to go to London for a few years, and then I want to travel, and then I want to do this, and then I want to start a business. Like, it doesn't have to be in that order anymore.
Definitely the younger generations are stepping out of that typical kind of like life progress, which our parents went through. And that it's really hard sometimes because your parents often want to instill their own personal values on you, and they might be putting a lot of pressure on you to purchase a property when you're 26 years old because that's what they did. Or they see you doing things that are different to what they did when they grew up and they just don't necessarily agree with it. But in the book as well, you talk a lot about how you talked about experience versus things. And I think very much when you're in your 20s these days, there is a bit more of a focus on, enjoying your time and maybe allocating your money towards experiences rather than just things. But how would you then provide advice to people who are trying to figure out their priorities? Because at the end of the day, experiences are important and you can't necessarily do the same things as you did in your 20s as when you're in your 70s, right? Especially when it comes to travel. Mm-hmm. But then how do you balance that with then saying, okay, well, if I'm wanting to achieve certain financial goals in life, especially buying a property, I can't actually just go and spend all of my money on experiences. How do you then just sort of sit back and balance that out and say, okay, well, how do I allocate a certain amount of money towards each of these things, especially when it comes to saving for a property, because that is such a big financial goal, which quite often people have to sacrifice a lot of experiences in their life when they're young.
I think I might challenge like the word balance for everyone to start with, because that trade-off between enjoying the present moment and having a great time today and going on that trip, and then also securing our future, whether that's investing or saving up for a property, I don't think we can ever perfectly balance it. I think it's always a matter of trade-offs and prioritization and what's important. And that will probably look very different year on year. So what was important time-wise, money-wise to you 5 years ago is probably very different to what's important to you today. And even 10 years in the future is going to be different again. So I think the important thing is just going, well, okay, I need to enjoy life right now. What am I going to do for that? But also being kind to your future self, because chances are you don't know that person you're going to be in 10 years, but you probably know a few things. You probably know they're going to want time to spend with friends and family. You probably know that they're going to want some element of financial security, emergency fund. Maybe they do want a property. Then maybe they want some investments that can provide them some passive income. And you probably know they want some time and they want to have choices. So even though you don't know that person you're going to be in 10 years, you know they want a few base level things. And then you're thinking about, well, what are some changes I can do today that is super kind to that person I'm going to be in 10 years. And so I think that's the challenge with property, because I know a lot of people do have to sacrifice a lot in that saving process for the deposit. And so working out, well, what are my priorities right now? And maybe you realize, well, there's just not enough money to do everything. There's not enough time to do everything, because time and money, we only have so much in our calendar, in our bank account every month. And so you might go, well, I'm going to reduce a few of those more expensive things from my budget at the moment because I'm prioritizing putting money aside for the house, but I'm going to still make sure there's enough money and time to have quality conversations and experiences with friends and family, because you don't want to get to the process of buying the house and of being completely miserable during, because that's life. You're using up time during that process. So if you have a completely miserable 3 years saving up to buying a house, well, that's 3 years of your life that are gone, that were miserable. So finding, you might have to sacrifice a few things. You might have to reprioritize a few things, but finding even low-cost ways to have the same experience, even though you can't spend as much money. I know a lot of people want to go out for a meal with friends and family because, one, they want to see their friends and family, but it's also things like they don't want to worry about washing up. It's easy to organize. No one has to worry about what's for dinner. So how can you take some of those elements of why you're going out with friends and family, but do them in a more cost-effective way? And so if you realize you just want quality time with your friends and family, but you don't want to worry about dishes and stuff, or maybe it's doing a barbecue at the park where everyone brings something. And so that's really cost effective, it's easy, but you still get to have those quality experiences with your friends and family. Because one of the interesting studies that I came across during the research for the book was called the Harvard Adult Development Study. And it's been going for over 80 years now, and they've tracked the descendants and the grandchildren of the original participants. And they found that the biggest determiner of people's happiness and well-being long-term was actually the quality of their relationships. And that's a really interesting one because sometimes I think we forget to put it up on our priority list. Like we've got all these goals. I don't know about you, Amy, but I'm very much like a goal person. And relationships wasn't up the top. And now that I know this, and now I know how important those foundations are, the things that you can't just spend $1 million on and get a wonderful friend and family group. You can't just buy those quality relationships. You can buy transient friendships, but you can't buy quality relationships. And so those things, even like your health, you can buy better. You could buy a PT, you could buy going to the physio and things like that, but it doesn't help with that foundation. You still got to work on your health yourself. And so identifying those important things like relationships and health and figuring out what you want to do at life, like prioritize some of those things because they're the things that even 30 years down the track when you're super wealthy, like I hope every listener is going to be, you can't just go to the store and buy those things. So I think just it takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. There's a lot to it, but just looking through your calendar and your budget over the past month and going, well, what's one small change I can make over the coming 30 days to add a little bit more happiness to my life?
In your book, you said that there are certain things that you can buy to increase and improve your happiness. And I actually don't think there's anything wrong with that. I know everyone says, happiness needs to come from within. It needs to come exclusively from your relationships with your friends and family and all of that. But it's not completely true. There are definitely things that you can spend money on which improve your happiness. But like you said, what money doesn't buy. In your book, you mentioned health, you mentioned quality relationships, purpose, which is incredibly important. And again, you can't buy that. Feeling content and also lost time. And that's something which I think is really, really, really important. And I actually find this hard to balance. So after reading this book, it made me reflect a lot on my life and my current situation because I work a lot. So I work 6 days a week, sometimes 7 days a week. My husband's also a real estate agent as well. And I've gotten to this point where I've worked exceptionally hard, but it hasn't, and my income is reflective of that at the moment, but that hasn't actually necessarily increased my happiness because with that extra work and with that extra money, I now have much more responsibility. I have much more stress, and I've also done what a lot of people do, and I'm living to my means. So with my increased income, I have increased expenses and I have increased debts as well. And it makes it then really hard to say at what point in time do I stop working so much so that then I can focus more on family and friends and relationships. And I feel like that sometimes comes down to a little bit of personality and being able to just give yourself a break. I don't think I'm quite there yet.
It's that saying like what gets you there won't get you there. And so you've done all this work to get you to this point where you want to be today, but then you might be going, well, over the next 10 years, I really want to spend more time with my family and I want more balance in my life. I want more time to do all of those hobbies that I've put off for 10 years while I built my own business. And so you're thinking, well, how do I want to change things? Do I want to be in exactly the same place in 10 years' time? Or do I want to have a slightly pared back work week so I have more time to do the crazy things I want to do? And so I think just thinking a little bit more intentionally, that's the only thing we can hope for. Like we're not going to change everything. Most of us still are going to have to work in some capacity, but just making small changes. And one of the interesting exercises that Owen actually taught me about was like designing your ideal Tuesday and your ideal Saturday. And why those 2 days is because Tuesday, typically a work day. Saturday, a day of just fun, do whatever you want. And so writing down just briefly, what does your Tuesday typically look like at the moment from the time you wake up to the time you go to bed? So is it like write down things like you wake up, you check your phone, you stumble into the kitchen, have a coffee, then just get out your laptop and work for a day, or maybe you go into the office, like put all those things down. And then also do the same thing for Saturday. And then maybe leave it a couple of days so they don't get intermixed, but then write down, well, what would you want your ideal Tuesday and your ideal Saturday to look like? Still being realistic, knowing that you probably have to have some form of job if you are in that income career building phase at the moment. And then comparing those lists. So what does my Tuesday currently look like and what do I want it to look like? And you might find there's not actually too many changes you need to make between your Tuesday right now and the Tuesday you want. There might just be in the morning you want to wake up feeling refreshed and you want to go for a walk first thing. So it might be, okay, we don't go on social media first thing. We put our phone in the study at night. And so we get up, we have our alarm, we go for a walk. And so there might be some small changes you can make, even just to the way you're working and living your days right now, that are actually going to add a lot more meaning and satisfaction to your life, because chances are you do have a little bit of wiggle room in your calendar. Most of us do find time for Netflix and social media at some point. And you might go, well, if I just added an hour more in my week where I was catching up with friends and family, well, that might give me a really meaningful happiness boost, but it doesn't cost that much. It doesn't cost much to our budget or our calendar.
I think it's also important to, especially when you're saving up for a property, balance up short-term happiness and short-term compromise and short-term, like I remember when I was younger and I worked jobs which I really, really did not enjoy. And you mentioned this in the book as well, I was willing my days away. I was just trying to get through every single day because I knew what I was doing at the time was getting me towards my longer term goals. And I was like, I'm really unhappy right now, but I know this is all for a purpose and for the longer term. And I guess for anyone in that situation at the moment, how do you sort of say to people there's a light at the end of the tunnel? Or how do you make sure there is actually a light at the end of the tunnel if they're working a job which maybe pays more money, but they're not happy in, or they're really stressed, or they just don't have time to do anything else? But I suppose as long as it's for a purpose and for a reason, is that something which can give you a bit of hope?
I think I've become more passionate about, like, if it's causing you like physical or mental stress and lasting long-term damage, I'd probably think a bit more seriously about whether it's worth it, because I've had friends and family that have done the thing because they wanted the goal at the end, and then they got to the end and they were so burnt out, they were really not in a place they could enjoy the end result anyway. And so for them, it might have been better to spread the 5-year goal over 10 years and maybe step back a little bit to 4 days at work, or take a role that was slightly more in their interests or less stressful, because it meant that they could enjoy the journey. Because I think that's so important, that we enjoy the journey along the way. Even though we might really want to buy the house in 3 years, we don't want to be miserable the entire time. And sure, there's lots of small changes we can do. So like spending more time with friends and family, and we can change things in our budget. Maybe we can side hustle. But if we're doing everything to get to that goal in 3 years, but completely losing that 3 years in the process, I'm not sure that's the most sustainable way to do it. So I would really think about, well, how am I prioritizing my health? And that's super important. Like some of those foundations, once they crack a little bit, they can take a long time to get back, and sometimes they can remain cracked. And so figuring out, well, what is my priority and how can I put that there as well? Because I guess
it's time that you don't get back at the end of the day, even if it is just for the short term.
Yeah, absolutely. And life's full of trade-offs and compromises, but you need to decide, well, what's most important to you, but also what's kind to your future self. And so you might take on a really stressful role for 3 years just because it's the extra income, but what damage is that going to do to you long term is something I would probably want to consider as well.
And how do we avoid or minimize the I'll be happy when this thing happens trap. You mentioned this in the book, and I'm a bit of a victim, personal victim of this, to say, okay, well, I'll be happy, or I'll feel more relaxed once I go on that holiday, or I'll be happy once I've got a certain amount of money in my bank account, or I'll be happy when I finally buy a house, because then I'll feel more settled and I'll feel more secure. But it's not necessarily a guarantee. And it also, you can fall in the trap of then saying, okay, well, that's achieved. What's next? Only now going to be happy until when the next thing happens.
Yeah, I think I'll be happy when trap can easily just fall into continuously shifting goalposts. Like, we're never at the point that we're happy. We're never going to have enough. And so it's partly a money aspect. So there might be a number at which we feel financially secure, but there's also the sort of the emotional aspect, because I know plenty of people that have worked their whole lives, built wealth, and then they just can't retire and they can't stop and they can't enjoy it because they haven't built a life outside of that. And so I think thinking about your life a little bit more holistically, because you want to make sure there's things that you're enjoying on the journey instead of just postponing your happiness to a future date, because then you're just living in the future the whole time. And that's really not the best way to live. I think you need to focus on, well, yes, reaching a goal can be really meaningful, but how can I make sure I enjoy the process? And maybe that means, well, putting more steps along the process, and so you can recognize each achievement along the way instead of just postponing your happiness until the point 3 years in the future. So one of your, like on your first home buying journey, well, maybe one of the milestones is taking a property course. Like, we've got a free one on Rask Education. That's like a step on your learning journey. Maybe one of your milestones is talking to a mortgage broker or a buyer's agent. And so you can actually enjoy the process a little bit more instead of just going, well, life will be better when I have a house. But chances are, when you buy the house, there's going to be problems with the house.
You're going to have different kind of problems then, because you have to manage your mortgage. You're then locked into something for quite a long time. Your cash flow position could change. There might be maintenance. There might be body corporate issues with that. So it becomes different issues once you've actually bought a house.
Yeah, like there's always, like, the grass is always greener. There's always,
yes.
Yeah, so I think it's just coming back to, well, how can I enjoy the process along the way? How can I get more people involved? Because that gives us a bit of a happiness boost if we engage other people in the process. So it's sort of a shared goal and shared accountability instead of something you're just doing by yourself silently for 3 years. And just celebrating the smaller moments along the way. So you might just celebrate and have a coffee and recognize how far you've come when you hit your first $10,000 when you're saving up for your deposit, instead of just being miserable that you're not there. And also, it's probably the aspect that hurts us the most is comparison in this regard, because we're seeing so many people around us that aren't even in our friends and family. Like, back in 100 years, you probably would have only compared yourself to where your friends and family are at, like the people that you could visibly see around you. But now we're getting exposed to millions of people and all these celebrities and online entrepreneurs that have completely different lives, have completely different stories. They might have debt. They might have had help from family. They might have started 10 years before you, or they might have just had a fake story that they're showing online. But it's just important to know that, like, that's not reality. You don't need to compare yourself to a million different people. And the easiest way to focus more on ourselves is just really being clear on, well, what do I want and how am I spending my time and money and what are my priorities? And so if you know what's really important to you and you can mute some of that noise, and that might just be simply unfollowing or muting people or unsubscribing, like, that is a tool. Social media is a tool. You get to use it too. And so thinking about how you can control that noise a little bit more so you can focus on your own journey. Because at the end of the day, you can read a million stories of people that have had inspirational property purchases and built their portfolios, but that doesn't help you personally take that step on your own journey.
Comparison is the thief of joy. That's one of my favorite quotes, and it's so relevant when you're looking at other people in your friendship circles or beyond that who are buying houses and thinking, well, how did they do that, and how come I haven't been able to do that so far? And then not only, there's always going to be people who are better off than you, and there's always going to be people that are worse off than you as well. And it also means that you shouldn't be embarrassed about your own situation or worried about being able to share your own wins, especially if you feel like you have been in a position of privilege, for example, being able to live with your parents whilst you're saving. Like, focus on that just being as a pure benefit to you. Don't be ashamed of that just because other people haven't been able to do that, because you're also then still working towards your own personal goals and you've got your own sacrifices as well. But I think that kind of brings us back to the overarching theme of your entire book, Kate, which is all about working on yourself, having this internal reflection about figuring out what your why is, figuring out what your money mindset is, figuring out what's holding you back. There's a lot of people who get into the habit of, spending money a certain way or having this certain attitude towards money, or saying it's too overwhelming, it's too hard, I don't have the right support networks. And these are all internal limitations which hold you back. So really focusing on yourself and figuring out what you need to do to achieve your goals and what is potentially going to make you happy. And is that money? Is that time? Is that buying things? Is it doing things? Is it spending time with friends and family? And then just focusing on yourself. I think that's the key message of this book.
Yeah.
And then we can bring this back to buying a house as well, and saying why do you want to buy that property? How much are you going to compromise your lifestyle in the short term? Is it going to be this thing that makes you all of a sudden happy? What's going to happen once you purchase that property and you have a mortgage? And just sitting back and reflecting on these questions rather than rushing into it, feeling like it's something that you just have to do and you have to get over and done with, or it's just going to be this thing that totally changes your life, because that is not a guarantee, is it?
No. And it made me reflect on some of the things you were saying at our Sydney event the other week, because you were talking about the importance of having a property brief and really understanding what you want and if it's realistic, and thinking about those things that make you happy could also go in that brief. Like, if for you, seeing friends and family is really important. Like, I love living a few suburbs away from my parents. I love that I have friends in the streets near me. If I wanted a big house and that meant I had to move an hour away from everyone and I wasn't near public transport and I couldn't easily see everyone I wanted to see because I like seeing them on a regular basis, I like being able to just pop in for a coffee, then that probably wouldn't make me happy. Sure, it might be a good financial decision. It might mean I get a huge house, but it also probably means that long term I wouldn't be as happy as I am now. And so thinking about, well, how do I like spending my time, and would that play into what property I buy?
Yeah, that is, oh my gosh, I get this so often where people say to me, I want to live in this certain property or live in this type of location, but maybe it's not necessarily the best long-term financial outcome for me, because maybe that type of property isn't going to grow as much. And yes, it's relevant, and yes, it's something that you should absolutely consider, because it could impact your choices or your opportunities in the longer term. But at what cost in the short run? If you could buy a bigger house an hour away from the CBD and in 10 years have some more money because it's grown more in value, but over those 10 years, you have just been less happy because you're not near your friends and family. It's taking you 3 hours to get to and from work each day. Is that worth it for you? There's no right or wrong answer here, but the goal shouldn't always be, like, in property, capital growth over lifestyle. It's not that black and white.
Yeah, and that comes up a lot with investing, because some people think they want to go down the individual share investing path and just manage the portfolio themselves, but then they realize there's a lot more to stay on top of. There's a lot of news to deal with. There's a lot more decisions to make, and that might end up being a much more stressful investment path for them. And maybe they would have been better focusing on a different, like, less resource, less decision-heavy investment path. So there's different options for everyone, and I think just knowing yourself a little bit more and spending some time like working out, well, what lights you up, what fires you up. Maybe you are super curious and you love diving into the numbers of a company, or you love doing all the research for a property, or you're quite happy to commute 1 hour every day, or you really love working from home and you have the ability to make a new family connection, community group in a new spot, well, maybe living further out might be better. So it's just like working out, well, what's important to you. Not the best decision for you and the best financial decision aren't always the same thing.
Correct. And not just listening to other people telling you what they think is best as well, which is another common pitfall in property. Your parents telling you should, buy a house in the suburbs, or you see other people do it, or, you hear about, land is always more important, and it's just not always the case. So Kate, thank you so much for coming on to the Australian Property Podcast today. Where can people get your book? Is it on Kindle? Is it only in the shops?
Amazon, Booktopia, Dymocks, and smaller bookshops usually have a couple of copies, or you can order it in from your library if you want to save a few bucks there.
I've recently rediscovered the library because I've been going there to get kids' books, and I don't know why I forgot about it for so long. I was spending like $12 every week on a new book on Amazon, and I'm saving that money now.
Libraries are phenomenal resources. Like, you can go and study there. They've often got activities or book talks going on. They'll have community groups, book clubs. Like, just go and use them. They're fantastic resources.
Yeah, I've done a few free first home buyer talks at libraries recently. It's been great. Really good turnouts as well.
Yeah, and they're usually in great locations as well. Like, they're great community meeting points.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much again, Kate. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me, Amy.
See you later.